Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is the third part of the making of Ruben. We are now talking about the mixing and mastering. There's actually some useful stuff in this video as opposed to the back one where we're just kind of like, look at all this old stuff I used to do that I totally don't recommend doing. But if you want it to sound like this is what I did. This sort of stuff, this is actually a little bit better. So the trick to this track, has to do with the fact that I do have sidechaining, but I'm actually not doing a lot of it. Or is it main duck is what I call it. I did say sidechaining, and boy, I'm always harping on about the difference between ducking and sidechaining, where sidechaining involves actually using a device that has a side input to process another signal by a separate input. But this is what we're doing. We're doing ducking, which is usually the result of sidechaining, where we are bringing down the signal level of something to fit the signal level of something else. In this case, we're bringing down the signal level of literally everything to fit the level of kicks and snares. However, we're not really doing that much. In the track, we see here, this is the ducking that I actually did with actual manual automation. And I have one for the kick and one for the snare, and they're not really that different. But the kicker here is that it engages slightly before the hit. In sort of the real world, where this is on fully all the time, what this means is that it gets rid of any possible kind of tail when the hit hits. And it's all the way down. So this means that right there, right at the hit of the transient of the kick and the snare, as loud as they are, that's as loud as they're ever going to be. They can be at perfectly 0 dB, and there won't be a single bit of competition until, you bring level and it goes back. Beyond that, actually, before we get there, let's note, though, that this is the ducking, and then this is the ducking level, which is saying it's only really on for these moments here. And we can really hear the difference when we sort of turn off the drums in the sub. The ducking is really only noticeable when this is on. However, there is actually still ducking when this is playing. This is very small. I have another fruity balance on here, and I just have the wet dry down almost halfway. So it's still doing the exact same thing, but it's super duper less effective. The sub is actually engaged in the same automation, and it's fully on the whole time. The sub is being ducked by the kick and the snare. The point of ducking the snare is that even though there's no frequencies that really conflict with the sub, because it gets deducted, it makes you feel like it has weight. And it also helps it to be snappier, because there's nothing competing with it, again, as we said before. Now, when you're doing it fully. But we're not really doing it fully. We're actually keeping quite a bit of the signal in conflict with everything else. Why did we do that? Well, as it turns out, this kind of extremely harsh ducking is not really great for fast-moving tracks with lots of kicks and snares. It's actually super duper hard making a drum and bass mix feel right because of this fact, because of how fast all the transients and kicks and snares are just everywhere all the time. Almost done being sick, I promise. Things like, drum step, which are halftime this, and then dubstep, halftime 140, where the kicks and the snares are much more sparse. You can be a lot heavier with how they hit. Oh my god. So this means that what we're after is the thing that I usually say I don't care about, but this is the idea of the transparent mix. And there's a couple ways we accomplish this. So the first thing I want to draw attention to is just how much louder the drums are than everything else. You can see it visually when we look at the drums bus versus the main duck channel, which is everything. You see that the drums is actually quite a bit louder than everything else. And you might be thinking, oh my god, it's peaking, how dare you, it's going to distort and whatever. And I just want to remind you, or maybe you've never heard this, but peaking in FL doesn't necessarily matter. It matters at the very end, last part of the bottom of your signal chain, provided you're using plugins that don't internally clip at 0 dB, which some of them do. So you want to kind of keep check of that. FL native plugins are not ones that do that. The reason why it doesn't matter is because while our playback is 16-bit or 24-bit depth, which caps out at 0 dB, the internal processing of FL Studio, and actually most DAWs, is 32-bit floating point. Not 32-bit, the processing architecture, but 32-bit depth for audio. Now, the thing about bit depth is that it's an exponential function in terms of increase in numbers. It's not totally exponential. It's a power of like 8 or something. I'm not fully sure about that, but really what that means is that 32-bit is insanely larger than 24-bit. And unlike 16-bit versus 24-bit, where 16-bit and 24-bit are different densities of the same range of status to 0 dB, 32-bit is the same density as 24-bit, and it goes above 0 dB, which means that if you have something that clips above 0 dB, the information does not go away. It's still there. The reason that we do actually hear it distorting, though, when we play it out of our speakers, because our playback is still 16-bit or 24-bit. And as well, we render it off into an MP3 file. It's going to clip if we keep it that way at the very end. But internally, which is to say this bus into the master, it can peak as high as it wants. It's still there. It's still fine. Just as long as we bring it down to below 0 dB at the very end of everything. So we have a lot of freedom in that regard. This is why I really have to ever pay attention to stuff like, you know, kick at 6 minus 6 dB, snares at minus 3 or whatever, everything else is some on the level. I've never done that. That's because I have never really had to care. Which is not to say that you shouldn't care, it's just that I don't care. Having said that, the point is that the drums bus is way louder than the everything else bus. And actually this is pretty apparent if I took the mastering off, just took all the effects off and turn it down. The kick and the snare are wildly louder than everything else. And that's not like I thought that was a good mix. I'm not just like, yeah, the kick and the snare are so loud, this is great. We want our end result to still be kind of balanced. But we are actually using the ludicrous leveling of the kick and the snare to achieve that balance through essentially ducking, but multi-band ducking. And we're doing this just by how compressors work. So if we look at the monitoring here, you can see here that when the kick hits, it gets pushed above the threshold, and then the compressor brings it down. Now, here's the thing about compression when we're doing it like this, and when we do things like ducking, is that when you take it down, it's compressing as a result of one particular sound. But if it's bringing down, this is the sum. This is the sum of all the bass in the track at the low end, which means that it's bringing down everything else in this particular band, which is set up as such. And then in the mids, same deal. The snare gets above a certain amount and it gets pushed down. So when this peak gets pushed down, it pushes down everything else around it. But because it's happening so fast, only for that one particular moment. This is precisely what we're doing with sidechaining and ducking and all that stuff, only this is happening in the multiband sense, which you could do manually, but we're letting essentially the compressor do it for us, which is the entire purpose of multiband mastering, multiband compression on a master channel. This is precisely what it's for. The idea that this huge kick peak can happen, and it'll bring it down when the kick happens, but it's only bringing down the bass. So only the frequencies that the massive peak is interacting with are actually being affected. Same thing with the snare. The snare primarily exists in the 200 hertz range. So when that hit happens, it's bringing down mostly the 200 hertz range, and also a little bit of higher up here, which is not necessarily because that's where the snare lives, but that's just because that's how big the band is, and a little bit also for the high frequencies of the kick and the snare. But even though it's still the same transient information from the kick and the snare, you notice that the higher frequencies are a lot faster than the lower frequencies. This is a benefit because if we were compressing everything together with just one band, even though the low frequencies last a long time, they'd be compressed, and they would actually compress and push away that long in the high frequencies, even though the conflict in the high frequencies is much, much shorter. So this is really like the whole purpose of multiband compression. And because of this particularly well sort of distributed multibandness, this also means that when the ducking happens, it's not as apparent. It's not as obvious as when I do full super everything ducking, which is intended to be heavy-handed, intended to be like forcefully obvious. But this, you can barely tell it's happening. It feels like everything just snugly fits together, which is, again, the purpose of it all. And of course, the usual clipping everything with the sub-saturation, but like not as much because the compression is pretty far down, which means that it's more. This is more master limiting than it is master distortion. But again, if you're unfamiliar with how the soft saturator thing works, is that we're essentially clipping things at 0 dB with what amounts to being a wave shaper, and or like a hard clipper, but we're sort of limiting how far above the peak scale because it's being compressed as well. And the reason why this works is because distortion, which is what this is, whenever you hear like harmonic excitement and saturation or whatever, this is all just distortion. But the reason why this works is because it adds higher harmonic content to the content that's distorting. So if you distort like a sine wave, that's just one frequency, you start to get higher harmonics added on top of the harmonic, the fundamental tone, which is extremely obvious when you do that to a sine wave. But if you like distort a saw wave, which has all the harmonics, it adds more harmonics to the harmonics that are already there, and it does almost nothing. So when you have a song that has like a lot of high frequency content, adding just a little bit more isn't terribly noticeable. There is a threshold by which it becomes noticeable, but that's different for every track, and it's sort of your job to determine how hard you want to push either the compression or the distortion. And the whole point of doing both is that we are sort of reducing the worst of both worlds while keeping the best of both worlds, which is, again, something that's going to have to be sort of calibrated per track and per artist, because different people will have different thresholds and different ideas of what sounds good and what sounds bad. We're pushing stuff as hard as I am right now. Indeed. The drums bus, like, I'm doing the same kind of thing, like just a lot of compression, just kind of beef everything up. This is really just run-of-the-mill stuff. The point, like, sort of the point of these band splits is that we're trying to represent kick, snare, and sort of whatever's left. Notice that all the time variables are really fast when we're doing drums. And that's just because the drums, the sounds themselves are fast. Like, they're very transient, they're very snappy, and they're very, like, in the moment. So they can't really, like, linger very long in terms of what you're doing with the compression. Otherwise, you'll start to hear it being muddy. That's usually what happens. That's why things sound muddy, is because you're compressing it too slowly. Not so much that you're compressing it too hard, although you can definitely do it too hard and too fast. But it's mostly that it's a time thing, not so much a threshold and gain thing. What else is important? Do I have superior drummer in this song? Oh my god, I do. Oh yeah, that's the fill. So I used to, like, if you saw the back project, there was a lot of superior drummer, like, things happening and the huge amount of mixing and whatever. And that actually did exist in this track before this part happened. However, I really this is like a very late addition, and I really just wanted the fill. So I just recorded the fill as the fill. And that's in here. And this is being compressed, like, heavily. I didn't even try the multiband. It's still kind of doing it just by nature of how loud stuff is, but it's mostly just, like, super compressing it. And the point and the reason for doing that, and, like, the minor amount of EQing that I'm doing, is because these things very specifically only show up when nothing is happening, or like, you know, like these ride patterns, and then, like, I use a crash. And actually, I have, you saw the balance in there, and you might have thought that maybe I was sidechaining it, and no, it's just because I want a particular kind of, like, super crushed feeling when the cymbals hit. And so I just manually created that as opposed to sort of doing it sort of what that sound is from, which is an artifact of overcompression. It's very interesting how things like ducking and sidechaining are, like, for what we use them for, are products of what used to be, like, super compression artifacts. Like, much what we're doing in here, where we're shoving it through specific bands that create the balanced, transparent ducking, is something that we're doing on purpose, and that's fine. But, like, old school house DJs would run their tracks through just single band limiters on their DJ gear live so hard that the bass and the kicks would duck everything else. And that ended up becoming a very signature sound of the genre, and people started to do that on purpose, and they would do that with just volume automation. And also especially a lot of older breakbeat tracks, like a lot of the crushy, smooth artifact feeling of it. Lots of buzzwords I know were the result of just, like, the kind of overcompression that I would do in the drums here, which is just, like, super, because, like, this is what they sounded like without the effects. And it's all about, like, making it particularly beefy for that 1 second. I wouldn't do that on the main kit and whatever. And I probably could anyway, because most of the whole point of the kit is that it's, like, the kick and the snare are just stupidly louder than everything else. And it's all brought back together dynamics-wise through the use of compression. Tiny bit of EQ up here to kind of balance out some stuff. It's not really a lot of deepness there. Really, that's sort of the trick of this track, is that stuff about essentially the point of multiband compression, separating, you know, what ducking is happening at what band, because that's what, you know, information is happening at that point, and not affecting the other bands with sort of conflict resolution that's from frequencies that aren't interacting with the area that are being affected by it. If that made any sense at all. I already explained it to you. You already saw that, so I'm not gonna do it again. I don't know, what am I saying about other stuff? That's really all that's super important by this track. Just my MO these days is everything gets sidechained or ducked. I really want to say ducking, but sometimes people don't really know what I'm saying when I say ducking, so I just say sidechaining just to make things easier. But it's not sidechaining. What is the way that I'm doing it? We're doing it manually. We are creating the ducking through automation. And other tracks on my EP, I did it with automation, but I used sort of automatically, like, enveloping. I used the envelope controller to trigger essentially a note. and that would be the thing. And the difference between that and this is that this allows us to trigger it before the hit, which has a particular benefit of ensuring that there is nothing happening when the hit happens, as long as I have it on full blast, which I don't because it didn't sound very good for this particular kind of track. And not to mention, the tracks that I'm emulating are kind of old. They're like more than 10 years old. Actually, they're about 10 years old. So that makes it like, it's not that they couldn't do this kind of thing back then. They absolutely did, and they could, but like they largely didn't. And the loudness war hadn't progressed to the point where things are as loud as they are now, which meant that they could get away with just sort of crushing limiters and having your loop just kind of do its job, and it would sound nice. And being that I was attempting to emulate that sort of style with this, I couldn't really go as that hard with this kind of thing. Which is not to say that people don't and that you can't. It's just that for the particular feel that I wanted to get, it was too clean and it was too hard for sort of the taste. Yeah. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all the good stuff. And also don't forget that you can actually buy this FLP from the Fix Store, fixstore.com/SeamlessR, along with all the other FLPs from this EP. This is actually the project you'll get if you decide to do so. You can get them individually as well. Don't worry about that. Just go to the page, go to the deluxe EP, and then you'll have a drop down. You can pick it all. You can pick it all at once, or you can get individual ones. There's definitely a discount for getting them all at once, though. Anyway, all that stuff, questions you can ask me, and as usual, have a nice day.